my name is Dave Reske, CEO of Now Speed Marketing, and welcome to this edition of Marketing in the Now, where we talk about the best ideas in marketing and digital marketing. And my guest today is Kari Hanson, CMO of Robin, which is a workplace management platform. Kari is a B2B marketing executive with deep experience building global brands and driving market demand. She's currently CMO of Robin and was VP of Marketing at Spiro.ai, which is a CRM software for manufacturers and distributors. She was also VP of Corporate Marketing at SailPoint, a leading provider of identity security solutions. Kari, welcome to the show.
Dave, thanks for having me.
Yeah, really glad you're here. You've had some amazing experience in so many different areas of marketing, but the issue that you and I have been talking about, and we want to dig deeper into, is this idea of building a market strategy around creating a category for your brand. And so tell me more about that. Tell me some of your experience about that and why creating a category can make a big difference for
Uh,
marketers.
so it's something I definitely am very passionate about on the marketing side. It also seems to be something that every founder or CEO wants to do, even if sometimes it doesn't make the most sense. And so I actually started the first 10-ish years of my career. I was at a PR agency working with some really small companies, some really big companies. And that's where I really learned the value of creating a category, especially for the startups taking on the big guys in the market, redefining the competitive landscape in your advantage has a lot of potential for smaller companies. Typically, that comes with coining a term. Everybody at the time used to want to have an acronym. I'm very acronym phobic and I hate that. But if you could coin the industry, define what it should be, then it puts these big companies that typically would own it on the defense in a way that, innovation is the differentiator. And obviously that plays to the hand of startups typically. So I did that in many different ways. I actually worked with a company that coined the term digital rights management, DRM, back in the Napster days. I was very junior. So I was not active in that, but I had a front row seat, and it was the most fascinating real world, just listening to the conversations, seeing how it was done. And then I went to Zoom Info, and then I went to SailPoint, and at SailPoint, I actually got to drive the strategy around creating a category.
Wow, that sounds really powerful. Talk to me more about how it changes the conversation when you can kind of let's take it to the end. When you own the category, when you created the category, how does that change the conversation, both from a marketing perspective and maybe from a sales perspective? Like, how does that really help you?
Yeah, I think, and just to be clear, you don't have to actually own the category. It's just pushing it and talking about it. There's a lot of benefits if you do it right. And so I think from a marketing perspective, it gives you this thought leadership, visionary point to just talk to. Everything lines up under this is why there's this new category. This is why there's a new class of, in B2B technology, it's typically this is why there's a new class of solutions approaching this. And that way you can put everything in the context that's meaningful for you versus reacting. And so when you're on the offense, especially as a startup, it's a lot easier because you don't have the marketing budget of these big companies. You don't have the brand awareness. But if you could have the contrarian, well, that's the way you might have been looking at this, but here's a different take. The press are interested, the analysts are interested. When you talk to prospects, sort of shaking up that status quo, it gets their attention and it really gives you that advantage as a thought leader, first mover, innovator. On the sales side, I think there's a lot of advantages for creating a category. And there's sort of two different camps, and the strategies behind them are very different. I think in the one camp that is typically easier would be what I would point to, like HubSpot did this, where they coined the term inbound. They didn't create a category. The category was still email marketing, right? So they didn't change a lot of the fundamentals, but they coined this term, and it was sort of the David and the Goliath strategy of everyone is doing this, but we're going to do it this way. We're calling it inbound, and here's how it can change the game for you. And they built a community who really wanted to be early adopters. And, at the time, marketers, they were running to HubSpot to get certified because they wanted to, put it on their LinkedIn that, hey, I know how to use this. I know what inbound in anybody in marketing, they already knew what inbound was, but it was this whole new category and everybody wanted to talk about it. And so you had this whole community talking about this category, talking about this term, and really elevating HubSpot along the way. And so as a startup, for those of your listeners who remember when HubSpot wasn't, the multi-billion dollar company, they got a lot of marketing lift from this, and then they built events around it and everything. And now, of course, they can really own that term. But I think from a sales perspective, they got walked into so many companies because marketers wanted to bring it in. And so if you have a prospect saying, "Hey, I want to be an early adopter, let's bring this in," and they're actually convincing everybody else in their company to do it, it makes the sales go a lot easier.
So it
So
sounds like
that's sort of the one camp where, but again, it wasn't a category, it was a term.
yeah, so that we'll talk more about that as we go through, but it sounds like a very powerful strategy. But tell me a little bit how you think about this idea of creating a category as different than just doing a good job with positioning and differentiation. Because marketers always want to think about positioning and differentiation, right? You're
Yep.
going to think about how your products or services are unique or different, and you're creating a position that's unique in the marketplace. But the category strategy takes that to the next level. So just help me understand like how the category strategy is different than just a positioning strategy.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue to the other side of the camp of actually creating a category, which is what we did at SailPoint, and it was for very different reasons. There was marketing advantages. We certainly got thought leadership movement, but at the time, SailPoint, I was hire number 30-ish. We were super early. We were selling into a very well-established provisioning market. And we don't have to get into the weeds, but it's basically that was like the plumbing at the time of security. And they had this new approach with governance. It was before all of the compliance. It was ahead of the GDPR and all of that those regulations coming in. And we were selling to a different buyer, but it was for the same budget competing with this provisioning product. And so what we needed, and at the time too, we were also selling into the Global 2000. And if you sell into a strong enterprise procurement situation where you're talking 6+ figures, sometimes 7 figures all in, at the time there was actually a procurement rule with many of these companies that if you weren't in a Magic Quadrant or you weren't in a Forrester Wave, had that analyst validation in this market, you wouldn't even be considered. And so, for many reasons, we needed a category because we needed to prove to the procurement, just to get into that, we needed to talk to the companies. They all rolled up to a CIO, but basically a new buyer competing for a budget that typically went to somebody else. And so we sort of had to change the game of what you were looking for and solve the same problem, by the way, but it was from a different approach. And so we had to sort of reset that. And we also really needed to make it a much more strategic purchase because at the time, these bigger companies, they could just sort of wrap and roll, give it in with some other things that they were selling, Sun, Oracle, they had a lot of other things that they were selling. And so they could roll it in. And so that's where, from a sales perspective, we really needed to drive this category so that we could change where the budget was coming from. We could elevate the value of what we were selling several steps up. And then ultimately it meant that what we were selling was worth a lot more. And so this is where, a lot of companies that really want to drive a new category, it's about a much larger total value of the contract at the end of the day. And so that's really what we were focused on. Obviously, marketing led the charge. We did a lot of work. We got a lot of lift from that. But it was really to, set the stage for the sales team so that, again, these bigger companies, they were sort of caught flat-footed because suddenly, they were saying, look, we can do this plumbing, if you will. And we were like, yeah, but we're sort of offering, the smart house that can also control the plumbing and this does everything else. And by the way, things like the GDPR coming out and, this helps you, that one doesn't. And they weren't ready for that in any way, shape, or form. And so at one point, we had a crazy high win rate because we had defined, and there was a couple other startups in the space that sort of followed suit, but we had defined what they were looking for, and these other big companies they weren't providing it, and their sales team didn't know how to respond to it for probably 18 months.
Wow. Sounds like an amazing strategy. And I mean, it feels like suddenly you find yourself in a position where you've got no competitors. You're the leader in the category that you've created. You've got no or few competitors, and it's easier to have those sales conversations, easier to get engagement. Sounds like a really powerful
Yeah,
strategy. Yeah.
it was, but I will say I was one of the ones all along the way that I was pretty adamant that we needed competitors because you don't have a market if you don't have competitors. And so, there were some people that were like, oh, if we really define this, we won't have any competitors. And, my view was, well, right, but if you're selling to a global bank and there's nobody else offering this, they sort of are like, maybe not. And so we actually pushed that these companies we were selling to were our competitors. They just were, 10 years out of date. And so we certainly wanted them to be competitors. There were some other startups in the space. When we first started this, I had to warn the executive team, the sales team. I was like, at some point, what we're talking about, and the term we were using was identity governance. I was like, at some point, it's going to stick. And I remember this back from when I watched the team at the agency with the DRM conversations, and I remember when competitors started using it, and I remember that everyone was so upset about it, but we needed that to happen because that's when the analysts paid attention. And so I warned everybody. I was like, in a couple of months, like the companies that we're kind of competing with are going to use this. They'll use a slightly different term, and it's good for us. So don't get upset. And then, of course, it happened, and they all got upset. But then it was like, no, this is good for us because now we have it's validation, and we know that we're ahead of the game because we've defined it in our terms. When you define the rules of the game, so that your product is going to win, let other people show up. But having competitors show up and say that they were part of it and push into it, it just sort of made analysts and the people who actually pay attention to a category paid attention a lot faster.
So you're not really trademarking and trying to own your category. You're trying to establish yourself as a leader in this new category, redefining the space, but other people can play. You're still the leader, but there has to be competitors for it to be a category, right?
Yeah, and one of again going back to the procurement rule, one of my goals, and that at the time, I think everyone was like, "Oh, this probably will never happen," but it did, was to get Gartner to do a Magic Quadrant on this new space. And the challenge was they weren't going to use our term; they were going to use something close. We really focused on the definition. They obviously had their own input. They had some very smart analysts, but I would say, most of what we were pushing for, like this is how we see the market, they aligned it because we focused on sending them really large companies who agreed with us, sending them examples, and we spent, a couple of years building that, and we ultimately got a Magic Quadrant in this space. And then the bigger win in my book, personally, was that provisioning space that we started in once we got the first Magic Quadrant, then I started, planting the seed of like, well, that one should be folded into this. It's all one big market. About 2 years later, that Magic Quadrant ceased to exist and was folded in. Um, and then Forrester followed suit. A couple of European analysts followed suit, and so they sort of built out this whole category. I'll use different terms, and so this is the challenge: is going back to like the inbound example for HubSpot, they wanted that term. They wanted a very specific term. They didn't want anyone to change that term. For us, we wanted the market. We wanted the category. Certainly, we used our term. We pushed it from a marketing perspective as much as we could. Even if somebody else used a different one, we used our words, but we wanted the category and we wanted the validation from, outside perspective.
Yeah, and coming back to the HubSpot example, then they followed up on that by building that into their ecosystem. And you're a HubSpot partner, you become an inbound agency, and they branded that. Inbound agencies were selling services for other products, but it all led to HubSpot, which is it's a powerful way to leverage that. Let's talk about like the execution on this. Can any company do this? Is this reserved for just companies in, with a unique technology that can do something that no one else can do? Or can any company move in the direction of creating their own category? In other words, are we limited only by our own imagination here? Or is it something that just, the select few can really execute on?
Um, I think anybody can do it. I think the challenge right now is everybody's trying to do it. And so, at SailPoint, like I said, we were 30 people. We were a small company, and we pushed. And I think this is where startups, they're aggressive. I came from the PR world, the analyst world, so certainly, I had the background to really focus on this. But we also invested very heavily. Like we knew this was a multi-year push, and there was an end game, and there were steps along the way. And I think there's some companies that think they should just be able to say, hey, we're going to call it this. And when people don't, they get upset. And, 6 months in, or, it took us years to get a category like this category. But there were, we had the thought leadership. There was a lot of wins along the way, like I said. I think the biggest challenge, frankly, is one, um, sort of dedicating yourself and understanding that, it could be 18 months of saying the same story. And just when it's getting so boring to you and you want to go try something new, it's just starting to resonate and you still have another 18 months. And that's, not for the weak of heart from a marketing perspective. Everybody wants to, I think sometimes the biggest challenge in marketing is focus and, holding true it. And, there's a lot of people weighing in of like, it's not working, it's not as exciting anymore, go do something else. And it's like, well, this is actually working, we have to keep going. It's a marathon. The other thing I would say is that yes, everyone can do it, but again, I don't think everyone needs to do it. Like if, again, for SailPoint, there were very big reasons that we needed to change the buyer. And we're talking about big companies. We needed the buyer, we needed the validation, we needed a market to really succeed. But I think in a lot of SaaS world today, and again, HubSpot is a great example. They were selling to the SMBs. SMBs aren't looking at Magic Quadrants. They're not looking at the Forrester Wave. And so HubSpot, I wasn't there, so I can't speak to what they were thinking, but they clearly didn't care at the grand scheme. I'm sure it probably annoyed them, but they didn't care that there was an email Magic Quadrant, email marketing out there. Now they're in CRM, but it's, they wanted this term and, you can do that a lot faster, a lot easier. And, a lot of times when I talk to companies, they'll come to me with, oh, we need a new category. And it's like, or you could just, sort of coin a term and, arm everyone behind it, or, sort of here's the vision of where you see the market evolving and you can get the same benefits. Like, do you really need a 5-year strategy here? Like, is that the long game or do you need something faster?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Talk to me about the difference between the term that you're talking about, coining a term, and again, just like a product branding or differentiate branded. Like what are you really trying to do when you coin a term and try to own that again versus having a category or just a product brand that you're trying to get out there?
Yeah, well, so when you coin a term, and I point to HubSpot, I'm in Boston. I think it's the greatest example. As a marketer, it drives me crazy because one of the outcomes of that is it has convinced every executive that there's inbound marketing and then there's outbound from sales. And I went to school for marketing, and I'm very well versed that there's a lot of outbound that I'm doing. The people just don't come and find me. That's a whole nother conversation. But they did it very well, and it's I think when you think about coining a term, that's where you want, and I personally believe that it's really good for companies who are probably on a startup, series A, B, maybe a C. They have some big competitors who are doing things slightly differently. They really want to go after an SMB or a mid-market company, and they really just need to sort of get attention of like why do they stand out? Like what is different? Because if you're in like the features fight, the big companies will win because they can promise every feature in the world and they can deliver it. Like you'll never win that battle, even if you truly have it. And so, usually for a startup, the reason that they win is their focus on the customers. Right, they make their customers super successful, and what's the secret sauce behind that? It's probably a different approach, or they're looking at it slightly differently. Their innovation of they're breaking the rules. They're not just working on the creature features, if you will, of what is expected. They're coming up with something entirely new, and they're probably having to sacrifice some of those core features that people are like, oh, but this could be a lot nicer. And I think when they coin a term, they sort of earmark like, look, this is where the market's going. They can very easily, from a marketing perspective, explain why they're doing this differently. And then again, that approach becomes their differentiator. And it also helps them explain on the sales side, there's a reason why we're not, trying to make this auto delete super easy. Yeah, I understand it's probably something you're used to, but we're really focused over here on how do you open the garage door? Like it's a different, like it gives them an answer because they can't do everything.
Yeah, so you're really wrapping your entire differentiated message, why you're more innovative, why you're scrappier, why you're going to make it better for them in this term, in this category, so that imagine you have to start every conversation like that, sales and marketing, and you're really getting that out there. It sounds like a powerful strategy. How do you do it? You talked about the steps of getting there. Just kind of walk me through, like if you're going to help, the company that you're working for right now start that category. or a new company, if they're going to embark on this journey to create that category, what are the steps? How do you think about this journey of getting it out there?
Yeah, so I think I'm very methodical on the marketing side, and I think, first it's really making sure you understand it's sort of the fundamentals of marketing, your ICP, and not just who do you want to sell to, but who are you successfully selling to and why? And does that like that sort of gives you it's sort of the biggest question, A or B, is do you need a category or can you just talk about a category? And because analyst strategy is very nuanced, it's very focused. Like I said, it's a multi-year strategy, but you need to figure out what is the end game. And then let's say once you've decided on that, it really starts with a positioning exercise of there is the product, but all messaging goes up to the product, and then you take a breath, and then all market visionary goes up above it. And so, what is so unique about your product without talking about your product? And that's really hard for some companies to answer. But when you start talking to customers, and again, I think, just inherently, startups, one of their differentiators is that they're focused on making their customers successful, where these big companies, they just assume it's going to happen and, it doesn't matter if they don't. Like it just, they'll figure it out or, they'll find an ecosystem. But what is it other than, and every executive team is like, oh, it's our people, and I understand that it's the people, it's the approach, it's the excitement. But why are your customers successful? What is it like? What problem have you solved, or what way have you solved it that was different? Because there's probably something there. And then that sort of gives you sort of that nugget for, okay, well, we see the world differently. And here's why. And that contrarian viewpoint, in my opinion, there's always, everyone loves the David versus the Goliath story, but it's really like, what is different about that little nugget that sort of changes the landscape. And then you can start, it builds out to, well, then now how does the product deliver on that? How does the product vision deliver on that? I think for startups, they need sometimes to be able, you don't want to sell product roadmap, but you want to be able to talk about where you're going because your vision in 2 years is something that will be unique. And so they want to really have that conversation, but also what's going on in the market. We for SailPoint, we were in the security space. There were a lot of security breaches, and so it was, well, how do those security breaches sort of either validate our why we need a new approach to this, or sort of show you the holes in the old technology? And we just sort of worked our way around. And the positioning is there's certainly the company positioning, but it's also the market positioning of the why and the what and the how. And then for the company, like I said, it can really when you talk about something like this, it can open up where you can talk about your product vision, which is probably one of your biggest differentiators. But no startup, the sales team don't want to sell on the product roadmap because that causes a lot of problems. And so it's like you can talk visionary of like, this is where the market's going, this is why it needs to change, and here's what we give you right now.
Hmm.
And it sort of transitions into, and here's our product right now, and let us explain to you why we're not going in this direction, but we're going in a different direction.
Hmm. So you built this entire, I'll call it an intellectual framework, right? You understand your ICP, you've got your positioning down, you've got the contrarian viewpoint. It's a brilliant strategy because you're building everything around that differentiated message, which is something that a lot of companies just don't do that well. And this takes you headlong right into it and focuses it. We just have a few minutes. I just want you to talk about like the downsides of the strategy. When does building a category go wrong? Like what can make the strategy not work and have you kind of go off the rails and waste a lot of effort in this kind of strategy? What should people look out for? What are the dangers, in other words?
I think, the biggest danger is this, and this is why I say, everybody wants to do it, but not everyone really needs to. It's not for the faint of heart. It's if you are a startup and you are really looking 6 months or 12 months out of like, this is what we need to do, this is not the right approach for you because the challenge is you will not have a category in 6 months. You will not have a category in 12 months. You might have some nice visionary pieces. You might have some small wins, but the collective, like, oh, yes, we're onto something, it's not going to happen. And so I think, one, just knowing what do you really need can be a sort of a problem. And then two, if you really do want it to dig into this, the biggest challenge that I mentioned is Sometimes, companies will be like, oh, this was really exciting. Everyone was paying attention in the first 6 months, but no one's paying as much attention now because the problem is when it's new, everyone's paying attention to it from a press and prospects, and then maybe it's like, point three or four in the conversation, but it's still there, and they're like, oh, it's not as shiny anymore, and they want to walk away from it or they want to change it. Where that's really where no, you need to keep going because when you're talking about a market, it actually does become sort of the underlying thing. And so it's not as shiny and it's not as exciting and it's not as new per se, but it's more of here's another example, here's another example. And there's a lot of companies and executives and sales teams that will push marketing of like we need to be shinier, we need to go do something different. And as soon as you take your eye off the ball, you've walked away from it.
Yeah, so you really need that long-term focus. And it sounds like you have to be really sure of what you're doing. So, kind of trying a bunch of categories here and there for a week or two at a time probably is a recipe for disaster. So it sounds like, doing that deep thinking that you described up front, really understanding where you're going and really focusing on getting that right, making the right bet, it sounds pretty important to the process because if you make the wrong bet, you're going to live with it for a long time, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. Although I will say, there has to be some level of flexibility in it too, in that, you might change the term multiple times and it's okay. It's
Hmm.
really about the definition. You might evolve that definition and you have to be open to that. Other companies might start glomming onto it, building the momentum. This is sort of where like a snowflake becomes a snowball, becomes an avalanche. They might have a slightly different perspective. You have to be sort of open to, broadening it out a little bit or sort of at least acknowledging, there's a couple ways to get to where we're going. They're going, they're taking this path, we're taking this path, but we're obviously all headed in the same direction. And so you have to be a little bit more flexible on that level. And, I think a lot of times everyone likes to get creative. Like I said early on, it used to be everyone what was like, what's the acronym going to be? And so everyone wants to get really creative of like this is the word and you overthink what the term is when at the end of the day you're probably not going to get to choose the term. SailPoint, we got lucky, we stuck with identity governance, that's what everyone used. I think ultimately it's ended up being like identity governance and administration or it was sort of changed a little bit. But you can't focus and a lot of executives are like, well, I want to put my the stake in the ground on this is the term and you fight the fight over the term, not the definition, and you lose the forest for the trees very quickly.
Yeah. Wow, it's a lot of good advice, Carrie. Thank you very much for that. This has been a great conversation about building a category. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. If people want to engage with you further on this conversation, to learn more about how you think about it or brainstorm some ideas, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
LinkedIn is definitely the best and fastest path. I'm Kari Hanson, easy to find.
Great. Thanks again for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.